The year was 1873. The air in the deep mine shaft tasted of iron and impending doom, a metallic tang that clung to back of the throat, thick with cold dust and the sweat of men who spent their lives chasing darkness. Young Thomas Reed, barely 20, was one of them. He wasn't chasing gold or glory. He was chasing survival, deep beneath the Welsh hills where the sun was just a distant, forgotten memory. Down there, in the suffocating silence, the earth breathes, shifts, and whispers secrets older than man. They say a man can disappear in the mines, swallowed whole by the endless, indifferent rock. But Thomas Reed didn't just disappear. He vanished. One cold, unforgiving shift, a catastrophic cave-in ripped through the St. David's seam, a shuddering gas in the mountain that sealed off miles of tunnel and snuffed out 26 lives. The sound was a hammer blow to the valley, followed by an eternal silence. Days turned to weeks of frantic, hopeless digging. Thomas Reed, everyone agreed, was just another name etched onto the long, black roll of mining sacrifice, another young ghost lost to the underworld. His mother mourned him, his fiancée wept, and the world moved on, heavy with grief. Then, 3 decades later, on a chill morning in 1903, a figure stumbled out of a long-abandoned, forgotten emergency exit miles from the original disaster site. His boots were decades-old leather, his miner's lamp a rusty relic, and his face was that of a 20-year-old man, unmarred by the passage of 30 brutal years. He carried the dust of 1873 on his shoulders, but the years themselves seemed to have forgotten him. The silence had broken, replaced by a terrifying, inexplicable phenomenon. This wasn't a ghost. This was Thomas Reed. And he had a story to tell that defied time, logic, and the very nature of human suffering. If the echoes of history, the deep mysteries of the past, and the chilling, true-to-life stories of human endurance and tragedy captivate your soul, then join our journey. Like this video, and subscribe to the channel. We exhume the most cinematic, tragic, and real events the world has forgotten, bringing the past and its deepest, darkest secrets back to life. Don't let the whispers fade. Follow for more. The darkness of the St. David's mine in the Rhondda Valley wasn't merely the absence of light. It was a physical, oppressive presence that weighed on the chest and smothered the spirit. It was a world of the miner, a realm defined by damp, by the constant, low groan of the earth above, and by the rhythmic, agonizing thwack of the pickaxe. In 1873, the Welsh collieries were the black engine of the British Empire, and the men who worked them, like Thomas Reed, were the fuel. Thomas was an uncomplicated man of 20, driven by the simple necessity of providing a shilling for his widowed mother and saving another for the modest future he planned with his fiancée, Ilara. Down here, 30 years before the world knew of electricity or telephones in every home, life was raw, immediate, and utterly dependent on the stability of the rock above. The air was thick, heavy with the perfume of newly cut coal, stale sweat, and the faint, acrid scent of the burning oil in their lamps, a smell that was the scent of life itself, a faint halo of hope in the suffocating void. Every man knew the risk, knew that the earth was a capricious god, ready to demand a sacrifice at any moment, but the wage was just enough to quiet the fear, to convince the soul that the risk was worth the potential disaster. The shift had been long, grinding, and unremarkable, which was, in the miner's code, the highest praise. Thomas was working deep in the newly cut seam, his back aching, his senses dulled by the repetitive work. When the first sound came, it wasn't the usual shifting or settling. Those noises were the mind's breath, familiar and mostly harmless. This was different. This was a deep, subterranean rumble, a sound that started low in the gut of the mountain and quickly escalated into a roaring, panicked wave. It was the sound of millions of tons of granite and shale deciding simultaneously that they no longer wished to hold their position. The oil lamps flickered violently, throwing dancing, terrified shadows against the walls, which began to weep dust and small stones. Before anyone could shout a warning, before Thomas could even fully straighten his back, the earth unleashed its fury. The sound that followed was less a noise and more a physical blow, a monstrous, deafening crack that fractured the very air. In the next instant, Thomas was thrown violently forward. The air was instantly replaced by a blinding, suffocating cloud of dust, grit, and pulverized rock. It was a chaotic geological scream. Timber supports snapped like matchsticks, and the tunnel walls collapsed inward, a terrifying rush of momentum and sheer, indifferent weight. The primal instinct to survive overrode everything else. Thomas, amidst the roar, felt a sudden, desperate lurch of the floor beneath him and the terrifying pressure of the air being expelled as the earth sealed itself shut. He didn't see the collapse. He only experienced the crushing darkness and the terrible, bone-jarring impact of the rock falling all around him, trapping him, not in a tomb, but in a pressurized, lightless pocket where the finality of the world he knew ceased to exist. Then an absolute, profound silence fell, a silence far heavier than the noise, an unnatural void where breath of life had just been violently snatched away. 26 men were gone, and the valley above felt the reverberations. The news traveled through the valley not as a bulletin, but as a chilling, seismic wave of understanding. In mining communities, the collective consciousness is brutally attuned to tragedy. They didn't need official announcements to confirm the severity. When the rescue teams arrived, they faced not a salvage operation, but a grim, immediate reality. A mountain had shifted its weight, and what lay beneath was permanently sealed. For days, the desperate effort was relentless, driven by a raw, frantic hope. They dug through choking rock and pulverized slate, driven by the knowledge that perhaps, somewhere, a pocket of air remained. But the earth was unforgiving. It had created an impenetrable wall of compressed silence, and soon the rescue became a recovery, and the recovery itself became a slow, agonizing realization of finality. For Mrs. Reed, the mother, the loss of Thomas was a tearing away of her future. He was her last remaining child, the strong back that supported her modest cottage. The small, coal-dusted village priest came, his face etched with familiar sorrow, and spoke the words of finality over the massive, impassive mound of rubble. For Alara, his fiancée, the grief was a sharp, personal wound. She was left clutching the simple silver locket he had promised her, a beautiful, devastating symbol of a future that had vanished beneath the earth. She didn't mourn a corpse. She mourned a void, a promise undone, a life swallowed whole by the very ground that was meant to sustain them. The narrative of Thomas Reed was simple and tragic. A young man, a victim of the earth's tyranny, another soul chalked up to the industrial age's relentless demand for blood and coal. His name was spoken in whispers, then less frequently, until he was just a memory, part of the solemn history of the St. David's pit disaster of 1873. The mine, however, carries its own deep, geological memory. Below the surface of the official tragedy, the engineers knew the true, terrifying scale of the collapse. Miles of tunnel were warped and crushed, but geological surveys hinted at vast, older, forgotten seams, deep, labyrinthine corridors that had been excavated by previous generations and abandoned, yet were structurally independent of the newer shafts. These were forbidden places, known only in folklore, sometimes mentioned by old-timers who spoke of impossible drafts and strange, faint sounds. It was into one of these forgotten arteries that the main seam's catastrophic pressure had shunted Thomas Reed. The legend suggests that the collapse didn't crush him instantly. Instead, the crushing force acted as a strange form of geological ejection, squeezing his immediate surroundings into a tiny, contained space where the rock walls held fast, surrounding a meager pocket of breathable air and a trickle of water, while sealing the chamber off from the rest of the mine. It is this precise, terrifying geological mechanism that sets the stage for the unnatural phenomenon. He wasn't simply buried, he was sealed. He was cut off from the noise, the light, and the linear flow of time. The world above ground, weighted by the certainty of his death, mourned him and moved on, decade after relentless decade. The industrial age surged forward, wars were fought, empires shifted, and technology remade the very fabric of human existence. But for Thomas Reed, encased in that cold, silent cradle of stone, time, the great destroyer of all men, was about to execute a shocking, inexplicable reversal. His chapter in 1873 was sealed shut, waiting for a 30-year pause before the earth decided, without warning or reason, to reluctantly release him back into a future that had long since forgotten his name, but not his face. The world that Thomas Reed had been forced into was not merely a large, empty cavern. It was a sensory deprivation chamber designed by geological cruelty. When the dust finally settled in that sealed-off pocket, the silence that enveloped him was a monstrous, oppressive thing, a total absence of sound that pressed on his eardrums and threatened to crush his very sanity. The only sound was a ragged, desperate rhythm of his own breathing and the slow, agonizing drip of water from a crack in the ceiling, a sound that quickly morphed from a sign of life-giving water into a maddening, incessant clock ticking away an unknowable stretch of time. His miner's lamp, a precious, tiny beacon of oil-fueled hope, cast a meager, fearful circle of light, revealing the prison walls, cold, damp slate and granite, closing in on every side. The air, initially fresh from the sudden pressure shift, slowly grew stale, heavy with the metallic scent of damp iron and the terrifying, stagnant odor of time suspended. The first few weeks were a relentless, agonizing war against absolute terror. His training, the miner's innate pragmatism, was the only defense. He rationed the water, collecting the precious drips in the small, upturned cover of his lunch pail. He ate the last scraps of his hard tack, chewing slowly, making each crumb last an hour, knowing with chilling certainty that there would be no more deliveries, no shouted warnings from a foreman, and no relief shift. The immediate fear being crushed gave way to the far more insidious, slow-motion dread of starvation and madness. He was entirely alone, not just physically, but spiritually, cut off in the shared misery that defined a miner's life, the darkness. When his lamp finally gutted out after weeks of careful, sparing use, a moment of final, absolute despair became the permanent, suffocating backdrop to his existence. This is where the legend truly takes its terrifying turn, where reality begins to fray into the impossible. How does a man survive 30 years in such a hostile environment without sufficient food and, most importantly, without aging? The historical whisper suggests a combination of factors. The chamber, perhaps, was a geological anomaly, perfectly cool, maintaining a low, steady temperature that drastically reduced the body's metabolic needs, similar to a state of suspended animation, a mythic, dreamlike slumber, a biological slowdown. The lack of sensory input, the perpetual darkness, and the profound, crippling psychological shock may have collectively triggered a physical response, causing his body to enter a state of near hibernation. Time, without sunrises, without seasons, without the measurable progression of human interaction, became an amorphous, liquid thing, losing all shape and definition. For Thomas, the months blurred into an indistinguishable, agonizing sequence. He ceased tracking the days, relying instead on the geological markers, the rate of the water drip, the small deposits of lime on the walls. His mind, starved of external stimuli, began to devour itself. He revisited every memory. The sound of his mother's voice, the texture of Alara's hand, the familiar curve of the Welsh mountains. These memories were his only source of light. Yet they also served as cruel reminders of the life that was moving on without him, aging and changing while he remained frozen in a timeless void. He walked the perimeter of his tiny prison endlessly, feeling the cold rock, searching for a seam, a crack, any faint promise of an exit that his conscious mind knew was impossible. The true, horrifying genius of the geological prison was the lack of decay, a phenomenon that lends weight to the myth of suspended time. In the constant cold and isolation, Thomas's body, robbed of the stimuli and nutrition necessary for robust cell turnover, seemed to slow its internal clock. He wasn't merely surviving, he was preserved. His world shrank to the size of his meager chamber, and the only progression he witnessed was the slow erosion of his own memories, the faces of his loved ones growing fainter, overlaid by the rough texture of the rock walls. He would whisper their names into the crushing silence, attempting to anchor himself to the reality of 1873, but the darkness was a powerful solvent, dissolving his timeline, making the past feel like a distant, irrelevant dream. The deep physical ache of hunger and thirst settled into a constant, low thrum, becoming part of the background noise of his existence, replaced by a profound, spiritual starvation. He relied on an almost spiritual connection to the stone, a miner's instinct honed by years of living in intimate contact with the earth. He listened for vibrations, for the slightest change in the air pressure, or the smallest trickle of dust that might indicate a shifting fault line, a potential exit, or a final collapse. For what must have been years, this vigil was a hopeless ritual. Yet, somewhere, perhaps a decade into his captivity, a new sound began to permeate the silence, an intermittent, extremely faint draft of air that carried with a distant, muffled scent of clean, outdoor air. It was a promise, a geological whisper of hope that was almost too cruel to believe. This draft was his anchor. He would press his face against the cold stone, breathing deeply, imagining the open sky and the smell of grass, fixating on the direction for which the air seemed to arrive. This was the subterranean river of time, flowing not in days or months, but in the imperceptible shifting of the Earth's crust. The pressure from the initial collapse, which had sealed him in, also, over decades, created slow, incremental cracks in the ancient, abandoned tunnels surrounding his prison. This draft was the proof of that glacial movement, driven by an almost superhuman will. Fueled by the draft's promise, Thomas began the work of freeing himself, not with a pickaxe. He had no tools left, but with his bare hands, his desperate fingers, and the ragged edges of his metal lunch pail cover. He picked, scratched, and dug at the weak points in the wall, focusing on the direction of the clean air, moving rock one grain, one small pebble at a time. It was a project that spanned the lifespan of an entire generation on the surface, a lifetime of slow-motion effort in perpetual night. He was driven not by the hope of seeing his loved ones again, for he had long accepted them as ghosts of his past, but by the primal, inescapable urge to simply rejoin the light. The final breakthrough, when it came, was not a violent explosion, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic crumbling. A section of the wall, weakened by decades of moisture and his relentless effort, finally gave way, opening into a winding, extremely narrow, decades-old maintenance shaft, an access tunnel that had been sealed and forgotten before Thomas was even born. He squeezed through the gap, his body emaciated and weakened, but his face smooth and unlined. He followed the increasing strength of the draft, crawling along the dusty, twisting shaft, a human relic emerging from a time capsule of stone. 30 years had passed above him, but in his mind, it had been a single agonizing, endless night. When he finally reached the end of the shaft, which opened into a long-abandoned, boarded-up emergency exit miles from the original disaster site, he paused. The sound of the external world, the rustle of leaves, the distant bleating of sheep, was a physical shock, a symphony of existence he had forgotten. He pushed against the rotten timbers and stepped out of the darkness of 1873 and into the bright, bewildering dawn of 1903. The moment Thomas Reed stepped out of the black earth and into the cold light of 1903, the world was immediately, violently, and tragically out of sync. His eyes, accustomed to the absolute darkness of his prison, squinted against the weak autumn sun, which felt like a physical assault. He was miles from the St. David's pit, having emerged from a hidden shaft deep within an uncultivated stretch of the valley, a spot frequented only by sheep and the occasional solitary farmer. His clothes, the rough, coal-dusted fabric of his 1873 miner's gear, hung loosely on his emaciated frame, yet his face, pale and shocking against the black dust, possessed the smooth, unlined features of a man of 20. He carried the dust of 30 winters on him, but not the years themselves. The first human being to encounter him was a shepherd named Gwillem, who was tending his flock nearby. Gwillem's immediate reaction was not empathy, but terror. He saw a man who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a photograph from 3 decades prior, a ghost clad in a historical costume. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice was a dry and used rasp, his tongue thick and unfamiliar with the sound of conversation. He could only croak one word, the name of the place he had left, St. David's. The shepherd, overcoming his initial horror, recognized the faded, antique style of the man's attire and the terrifying clarity of his unaged face. The subsequent journey back to the village was a slow, surreal procession, as word of the ghost miner traveled ahead of them on the invisible wires of gossip and disbelief. The true, deep tragedy unfolded not upon the rocky hillside, but in the familiar, winding streets of the village of Aberdare. When Thomas was finally brought to his own cottage, the shock was total and absolute. His mother, who had been a vibrant woman in her 40s when he vanished, was now an old woman, bent by labor and grief, her hair white, her face a map of the intervening 30 years of struggle. When she looked at the young man standing on her threshold, she saw the boy she had mourned, not her son. It took a painful, agonizing exchange, his recitation of small, intimate, utterly forgotten details of their life together in 1873, before the impossible truth pierced her disbelief. She did not embrace him instantly. She recoiled, gasping, overwhelmed by the sight of her 20-year-old son standing next to her 60-something-year-old self. Her shock was a mirror held up to his own mortality, showing her exactly what time had stolen. The encounter with Alara, his fiancée, was perhaps even more devastating. She was no longer a girl. She was a mature woman, the mother of 2 grown children, her hands rough with years of domestic work, her eyes holding the deep, knowing sadness of a life lived. Thomas, the man she had wept for and finally let go of, stood before her, the eternal 20-year-old, a living, breathing photograph of the past. The promises they had made, of marriage, a home, a future, were rendered meaningless by the sheer, unyielding weight of 30 years. She had built a new life, a rich tapestry woven from loss and recovery, and Thomas's reappearance was not a reunion, but in shattering intrusion. He was a beautiful, tragic monument to a life she couldn't return to, a stranger who wore the face of her first great love. The sheer, breathtaking anomaly of Thomas Reed's appearance created an immediate sensation that rippled far beyond the valley's narrow confines. For the villagers, he was a walking, breathing paradox, a disruption to the natural order of decay and progression. His physical state made the intervening 30 years feel like a profound illusion. He was perfectly preserved, but the world he walked back into was unrecognizable. 1903 was the cusp of a new, electric age, a time of unprecedented change that had rendered the 1873 world he left behind utterly archaic. The horse-drawn carts he remembered were now competing with the loud, smelly, terrifying spectacle of early automobiles. The gas lamps of the village had been replaced in many places by the faint, humming glow of electric lights. The very pace of life had quickened, accelerating into the relentless momentum of the 20th century. Thomas was an artifact of his own tragedy. He was unable to understand the simple mechanics of a telephone, mistook the sight of a bicycle for a strange new mechanical beast, and his memory of global politics was 30 years stale. This was a profound and isolating burden of his miracle. He had survived time, but in doing so, he had lost his place within it. He was a man with no social context, no relevant skills, and no understanding of the money, technology, or societal norms that governed this new era. The world had moved on, and it had moved on without him, leaving him stranded not in space, but in a separate, irretrievable era. The emotional toll was the heaviest burden. He looked at his mother's tired, aged hands, the children of his former fiancée, and understood the irreversible march of immortality, a force he inexplicably had momentarily escaped. Every person he knew was either gone or profoundly changed. The men he had worked with were now old-timers, some crippled by the decades of labor, others dead. They viewed him with a mixture of awe and profound, disturbing envy. They had paid the price of life, age, suffering, loss, while he had emerged from the darkness, having paid nothing, yet possessing everything they had lost, youth and time. But what good was youth when the object of that youth, the future he had planned, was gone? His experience in the cave had not saved him. It had exiled him. The local doctor who first examined him was baffled, unable to offer a scientific explanation for his lack of aging and prolonged survival without sustenance. The lack of deterioration was staggering. The doctor's report, however, didn't matter to the public. The mere fact of his existence, the living proof that a man could slip the leash of time, was a lightning rod for superstition and sensationalism. The valley, steeped in centuries of Celtic folklore, immediately latched onto ancient tales of the TYLWYTH tag, fair folk, and the concept of time slippage in the deep earth. They whispered that it had not been sustained by air and water, but had been held captive by the earth itself. Perhaps in a place where time ran slower, a geological sanctuary touched by forces man could not comprehend. Thomas Reed was no longer just a miner. He was a phenomenon, a legend that demanded an explanation far greater than simple physiology. He was a ghost in the flesh, returned to haunt the world that had forgotten him. The story of Thomas Reed was too rich, too baffling, and too perfectly timed for the burgeoning sensationalist media of the early 20th century to ignore. Within weeks of his reemergence, the quiet tragedy of a Welsh mining town was transmuted into a global phenomenon, spread via telegraph wires, and shouted across the front pages of newspapers from London to Chicago. He was christened variously the time-lost miner, the geological ghost, and the man who defied decay. The narrative wasn't constrained by facts. It was amplified by the public's desperate hunger for the impossible, for a story that broke the iron laws of mortality. The first wave of scrutiny came from the press, who descended upon Aberdare like vultures, turning Thomas's cottage into a focus of intense, unrelenting harassment. Every detail of his antique clothing, his mannerisms, and his inability to grasp modern concepts was scrutinized, exaggerated, and sold. The economic desperation of his family was quickly exploited by unscrupulous promoters who saw him not as a suffering man, but as a circus exhibit. There were offers for lecture tours, for photographic rights, and even for stage public appearances where Thomas, bewildered and often silent, would stand next to a chronologically aged contemporary to emphasize the terrifying difference in their appearances. He was trapped once again, not by rock, but by the relentless, invasive gaze of a fascinated world. The second, more brutal layer of scrutiny came from the nascent scientific community. Doctors, physiologists, and early psychologists traveled to examine him, attempting to apply the cool, rational lens of modern science to an event that seemed to mock their principles. They meticulously documented his apparent age, his metabolic rate, and his health, finding no medical precedent for 30 years of near starvation coupled with zero biological aging. The theories range from plausible to fantastical. Deep psychological repression bordering on catatonia, which might have lowered his bodily functions, an extremely rare, geographically isolated pocket of air that contained an unknown gaseous compound which somehow inhibited cellular decay, or simply a colossal, cruel hoax orchestrated by Thomas or his family for monetary gain. Yet, the consistency of his story, the intimate, verifiable details he provided about the 1873 disaster, and the genuine, visceral shock of his mother and fiancé all spoke against simple deception. This debate over Thomas Reed quickly became a cultural battleground reflecting the era's transition. The pragmatic industrial world, represented by the scientists and engineers, insisted on a quantifiable explanation, a hidden spring of pure water, a unique pocket of temperature. They denied the mystical. But the majority of the public, particularly those in the deeply religious and folkloric Welsh valleys, embraced the supernatural explanation. They invoked the ancient myth of the land, the proximity of the mines to the legendary otherworld, the places where the veil between mortal time and eternal time was thin. They argued that the earth itself, the great, slumbering body of the mountain, had claimed Thomas and then, for reasons unknown, had released him, untouched by its power, but profoundly damaged by its silence. The legend, therefore, became less about Thomas Reed the man, and more about what he represented. The horrifying possibility that time was not a steady, reliable river, but a capricious current that could sweep away one individual and leave another standing still. His unaging face was an uncomfortable challenge to the certainty of human mortality. If one man could pause time beneath the earth, what did that say about the finality of death? For the skeptics, the questions were about proof and process. For the believers, the questions were about fate and the terrifying, unknown power that lay just beneath the surface of the recognizable world. The man, Thomas Reed, had been consumed by the myth of Thomas Reed, and the final cost of that transformation was yet to be tallied. The ongoing medical and public investigation into Thomas Reed introduced a particularly chilling, often overlooked factor: the state of his mind. While his body appeared suspended in time, his psychological state was a devastating mosaic of elapsed decades. He suffered from profound temporal disorientation, often speaking of events from 1873 as if they had happened yesterday. The simple act of crossing the street or witnessing a train filled him with paralyzing dread, his senses overwhelmed by the pace and noise of the 20th century. The psychologist posited that the sheer, unbearable isolation had not preserved his mind, but it shattered its connection to reality. He existed in a permanent state of post-traumatic fugue, his brain locked in a desperate attempt to reconcile his youthful appearance with the lost reality he was forced to inhabit. The most insidious attack on his credibility came not from outright denial, but from recontextualization. Historians, seeking to save the narrative from the clutches of superstition, began to dissect the original 1873 disaster reports. They focused on the vague, often chaotic nature of the immediate aftermath, arguing that the true miracle wasn't survival, but the human error that led to him being counted among the dead. Perhaps, they argued, he had only been trapped for a few days in a different, overlooked part of the mine. And the story of the 30 years was a collective delusion, a desperate narrative created by a man whose mind was broken by the initial experience, or perhaps a rumor amplified by the sensationalist press. They sought a rational loophole, a way to pull the legend back from the terrifying abyss of the inexplicable. But the legend resisted simple dismissal. The meticulous detail in his accounts, the names of miners who died, the precise layout of the 1873 seams, the color of the paint on the mine manager's house, were too accurate for a simple fraud or confused memory. His very existence was a rhetorical question posed to the age of reason. He stood as living evidence that the subterranean world held secrets that defied all current understanding of biology and physics. Was he a case of profound biological stasis, a geological accident where the chemistry of the earth interacted with human physiology in a way never before observed? Or was he something simpler, yet infinitely more tragic? A man who traded the finality of death for the eternal burden of being an outsider? The scientific inquest eventually ran dry, unable to explain the youth of his skin, the integrity of his organs, or the decades-long survival, leaving the world to settle on the most dramatic and least satisfying explanation: the possibility that Thomas Reed was truly a man who had slipped the bonds of time. The legacy of this intense scrutiny was brutalizing for Thomas himself. He was poked, measured, photographed, and questioned until the last vestiges of his privacy were stripped away. He became a case study, a footnote, a profitable anomaly, but never again simply Thomas Reed, the man. The earth had saved his body only to sacrifice his identity to the voracious appetite of myth. The time-lost miner became a permanent symbol, a testament to the chilling power of the unknown, standing at the uncomfortable intersection of science, fear, and enduring Welsh folklore. The story of Thomas Reed didn't conclude with triumphant reunion or a satisfactory scientific explanation. It devolved into a protracted, agonizing denouement that exposed the ultimate cruelty of his miracle. He was a man who had been given time, but stripped of the context that made time meaningful. He carried the face of a 20-year-old, but the soul of a relic, forever haunted by the 30 years of life that everyone else had lived and he had missed. The greatest tragedy was not his time in the dark, but his life in the light, which became a performance of his own trauma. He found himself perpetually isolated. His mother, while relieved, could never truly reconcile the aging woman she was with the unaged boy standing before her. The difference was a constant, sharp reminder of her own losses. Ilara, his lost love, treated it with profound, careful pity, the affection one shows to a cherished, beautiful, yet ultimately broken artifact. He could not integrate into the fabric of the community. The children of 1903 knew him only as a legend, the strange, silent man who defied age. The men his own age regarded him with a blend of suspicion and awe, preventing any true companionship. He was forced to watch the steady, inexorable march of time in everyone else, the ultimate cosmic joke played upon a man who had briefly escaped it. The laughter and language of the people were alien, the world's momentum too fast, and the silence of the cave began to feel less like a prison and more like a simple, understandable sanctuary. The financial exploitation, the endless interviews, and the constant demand for him to perform his survival eventually took their toll. Thomas retreated into a quiet, profound despair. He was unable to work the mines again. The sound of the earth was now an unbearable trauma, and his body, though young in appearance, was fragile, having been sustained for so long on the barest thread of existence. He lived a marginal life, sustained by the occasional payment for an article or photograph, but mostly by the strained generosity of his aging mother. He existed as a constant, gentle reminder of unnatural duration, a man who proved that survival, when separated from continuity, can be a fate worse than death. His final years remained shrouded in the same ambiguity that defined his miraculous return. Some accounts suggest he was eventually admitted to an asylum, unable to bear the weight of his temporal dislocation, slowly losing his grasp on the shared reality of 1903. Others claim he simply vanished again, overwhelmed by the light and noise, perhaps instinctively drawn back to the deep silence and constant temperature of the earth that had once preserved him. The most poignant accounts, however, suggest he lived out his days as a quiet, solitary figure in the Rhondda Valley, dying sometime in the 1920s, having lived 30 years in the cave and another 20 years as a ghost in his own future, eventually catching up to mortality he had briefly deferred. The legacy of Thomas Reed is not one of triumph, but of enduring, tragic myth. The story faded from the sensationalist front pages, but settled permanently into the bedrock of Welsh folklore and the collective consciousness of industrial tragedy. He became the symbolic embodiment of the price paid by the mining communities. The idea that the earth, which gives life and wealth, also demands a horrific toll, sometimes claiming not just life, but time itself. His tale stands as a philosophical challenge, forcing us to reflect on the nature of power and mortality. Power, in this context, was the Earth's ability to manipulate the most fundamental element of human existence. Mortality was a terrifying certainty that while Thomas Reed's face could remain 20 years old, the world around him, and eventually he too, would succumb to the ultimate, indifferent force of time. The deep mine, that black, silent cradle, had offered him a glimpse of eternity. But the ticket out was a lifetime of alienation. He returned, not as a hero, but as a perpetual outsider, the man who was 20 years old forever, paying the true weight of the unlived life.